Ladies and gentlemen, it's 11:20. I think we should resume with the second part of the Prestige Day with the other two speakers. The first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Mr. Craig Lemboe. He has been introduced to me by a very good old friend in Stellenbosch, Dr. Johan Snyman. We've been working together in the building industry for more than 30 years. I did the political analysis, and Johan in his company MFA did construction and building statistics. Johan in the meantime went on pension, and it seems to me the new guru in the country on the building and the construction statistics and the industry is nobody other than Craig, who is a senior researcher at the Stellenbosch University's Bureau for Economic Research. Craig, if you want to say something more about yourself, you're more than welcome. It's up to you, and I'm going to give you time until 12:10.
Thank you so much, Theo. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to share some of my thoughts and my insights with you today. Let me just share my screen briefly with my presentation, and you should be seeing it now. I will unshare my video for the purposes of the presentation. I'm not someone that you'd want to see constantly for 40 minutes, I don't believe. But yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to share some of my insights. It's wonderful that we are able to speak to each other from different parts of the country, possibly the world. I am in rainy Cape Town, and my 3-year-old son, I just need to warn you, is in the next room waiting for an opportunity to barge into the study. If he does and he shouts loudly, "It's a pandemic," please forgive him. I will be looking at the topic given the spatial response on the crisis, not from sort of typical migration perspective, but largely looking at it from a construction perspective. And I've framed the discussion around 3 themes. The recent past, the current state of the sector, and the future. So very much like A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, but for the construction sector. But I do want to just start off with a disclaimer that at the moment the number of unknowns is much greater than the number of knowns. So my discussion will look at some of the economic statistics and some of the economic data. It will not necessarily present you with answers, but hopefully it will clarify some of the context. And also for further clarification, just want to provide you with a sort of definition of construction or the construction sector. It is typically divided into 2 components: building construction. So this is homes and offices, and this is largely a function of private sector investment, and then the civil construction sector, which we more colloquially refer to as infrastructure. This is bridges, roads, airports, etc. And the bill for this is usually footed by the fiscus. So much of the discussion is going to be on the building construction sector, although I will make the distinction between the presentation. So let's move into construction sector past. So I think from my I've also completed an MBA, and in my research on crisis and firms' responses to crisis, it does seem as though a number of crucial aspects of a crisis that determine an industry or a sector's potential response. First, it's the performance of the industry before the crisis, and second, the amount of wiggle room to mitigate said crisis. A sector that is doing well, for example, before a crisis, or at least for some time before a crisis, with prudent leadership or prudent business managers, would have had an opportunity to save for a rainy day, more so than an opportunity that has struggled or with a history of underperforming. Unfortunately, and probably known to most of you, the construction sector squarely falls in that sort of latter category. The graph that I'm sharing on your screen is just something that I've pieced together quite quickly. what I've done is I've indexed the real output for the construction sector, and I've compared that against overall GDP, excluding the construction sector, just to see how this has changed over time. And you can see that for the most part of the last 10, even 15 years, South Africa has invested quite heavily, and much of this investment is in office and banking and shopping centers, and understandably so. In 2010, prospects for the African economy were relatively upbeat. We were still considered to be the gateway of Africa. We had just successfully, at least from a global marketing perspective, hosted the Soccer World Cup final. So understandably, we were preparing ourselves for the coming prosperity, and we invested heavily, particularly in office space, and particularly in retail space. And that is the period which covers from about 2010 to about 2015. We were disappointed by the economic performance, at least. And since 2015-16, you can see how the performance relative to the economy has changed, and how it's actually turned sharply relative to what the rest of the economy is doing. And a number of construction firms have, over the last while, even before the crisis, been under significant pressure. But I don't think so. This is the official data that comes from Stats SA, and perhaps it doesn't fully capture how depressing the situation has or was up until 2019 in the construction sector. So the BERs, or the Bureau of Economic Research, to which I'm affiliated, where I work, part of Stellenbosch University, we do a sort of sentiment index on a quarterly basis, and we ask contractors, both in the building sector and the civil construction sector, are you happy? Very simplistic, but it's got a strong sort of academic foundations. Are you happy with the current state of the business environment? And if you were to rewind the answers to that questions to 2015, 2016, there was relative optimism for builders or building contractors. That index averaged about 50. In other words, contractors were neither too optimistic or too pessimistic, which is a sort of neutral level. And for civil contractors, it was sitting at a level of about 41. In 2019, so again, at the period just before the crisis, in 2019, those sort of sentiment indices soured dramatically. In the building sector, only 28% of respondents were satisfied with the business environment. And in the civil sector, only 15%, which means 85%, and this is on average for 2019, 85% of civil engineers were dissatisfied with the state of the business environment. And a large part of that was about access to work and availability of work, and the sort of tendering environment that they've had to deal with. So it was a sector which went into the crisis on the back foot, and a lot of these factors were exacerbated during the course of the pandemic. Before I go on to the sort of brief discussion of the current state of the construction sector, I want to caution that to analyze the full effect of on the construction sector, and by extension the future of the industry, is a little bit premature. I remember being asked to do an interview in September last year about the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I turned the interview down, because my opinion back then, or my view back then, was that we're far from over. I mean, it's not past us yet, so we cannot view the government's impact holistically yet. And since then, we've gone through a second wave. We are in the midst of a third wave, and with the pace of vaccination so far, we're likely at least to experience a fourth wave. So we cannot yet talk about the impact of the crisis in entirety just yet, but there are some trends over the past few quarters which I would like to highlight, which has a sort of bearing on space space utilization or the utilization of existing space. The first graph I want to show you is relatively pessimistic if you are in the construction sector. So I've done a similar exercise to the previous graph. I've indexed activity to the fourth quarter of 2019, and I've just tracked it until the most recent GDP statistics, which were released at the beginning of June, which covers up until the first quarter of this year. And you can see there the agricultural sector has recovered quite nicely, the staggered line, blue light on top, and right at the bottom, lo and behold, is the sort of already struggling construction sector. Now, if you had to compare it to the fourth quarter 2019 level, you can easily say that activity or output is down in excess of 15%. In fact, at closer to 20%. So there's 20% less work being completed by in the construction sector than compared to the fourth quarter of 2019, and it is by far the sort of worst performing sector within the broader economy. But to be fair, I think it is worth mentioning that construction sector, particularly the non-residential building construction sector, is a lagging sector. We typically find that on average it takes a number of quarters longer for the construction sector to recover than the rest of the economy from a particular crisis, such as the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and the crisis that we're seeing now, largely because we need other sectors to before we start seeing this sort of in office spending and shopping center spending in normal times, and these are unfortunately abnormal times. But it's not a sort of only dire straits. I think there are indicators and there are pockets of excellence that we're seeing as people shift, as social and human behavior shifts in the aftermath of the initial heat that the pandemic produced. And I think one of those is just in terms of how the residential property sector is faring. Now, I don't think it has been enough credit given to the interest rate cuts that we've seen over the past few years in the repo rate and then subsequently the prime interest rate, and the impact that it had on the economy. Not only has it lifted household income by lowering payments of existing debt, but it also spurred demand in this residential property market. Now, what I show in this graph, or show on this graph, is the F&B valuers index. The data goes until April, and what F&B does is they ask a set of their realtors questions about supply and demand. In other words, how much traffic is there for people wanting to sell their property, and how much traffic is there for people wanting to buy property, residential property. And a level of 50 indicates sort of neutrality. It's more or less equal between supply and demand. Anything below 50 indicates that there's sort of excess supply, and above 50 excess demand. And you can see over time how this is tracked various cycles, or the short-term cycle in the residential property market, particularly if you look at this period in 2001 until 2004, when we had sort of mini housing boom locally and internationally, how much demand actually did supply, and again in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, how supply far exceeded demand in that particular period. And while where we are now, we still have a sort of excess supply, it has turned quite dramatically, and that turn has been as a result of these monetary policy interventions, as a result of the lower interest rate environment. Families, individuals who are unable to qualify for a mortgage 3 years ago now can. And property commentators, or property sector commentators, highlight additional trends. Firstly, the high proportion of first-time buyers. So again, it supports that people who are unable to buy before now can afford a home. The fall in the average age of successful applicants. So if you were planning to buy a house in 2 or 3 years' time based on your finances, that was brought forward, again with a caveat that you managed to keep your job, that you didn't take too much of a cut, so a salary cut. So but it is a particular market. And then also the resurgence of demand outside of metropolitan areas. So the revival of coastal towns and quaint little villages, as people look to buy there and are able to buy there because they're able to work remotely or work from now within this new dispensation. So we have seen this change and this rise in residential demand, but it has come at a cost, and the cost is the sort of change that we're seeing in flat vacancy rates. So a lot of the people, or a number of the people that are now buying, used to be very reliable tenants. So left their flat or their townhouse and they've moved into their own property, and they just weren't new tenants to take up space. And at the moment, according to TPN, we're sitting, at least in the second quarter, flat vacancy rates nationally at about 13%, 13.2%, which is exceptionally high given the type of market that we have. As a result, and I'm sure part of your MBA included a course in economics, as a result, we've sort of rental prices take a substantial knock. In fact, rental prices are now lower than what they were a year ago. So what you're able to rent, or the rent that you're able to get for your flat, is now less than what you would have received 12 months ago. At the same time, costs such as levies, costs such as municipal accounts, all those have been rising. So while we're seeing this resurgence in new buying, we are seeing on the other end of the spectrum this much higher flat vacancy rates. And it's quite interesting if you look at some of the other statistics, and part of the underlying information is that the type of homes individuals are moving to typically differ from the flat and townhouse in which they did previously. Because we're able to do so much more at home. But I will unpack some of those factors in the discussion on what the future looks like. At the same time as what we're having these high vacancy rates in the residential flat rental market, we're sitting with exorbitantly high vacancy rates in terms of office space. So this is the non-residential sector. So Roda and Associates in the second quarter of this year started with a new survey to measure vacancy rates and vacancy rate factors, and their assessment or their analysis calculates the vacancy rate in terms of these factors on the left-hand axis, and it corresponds to certain percentages. So a factor of 1, as detailed by the landlord, would mean that space or occupants or vacancies in that space is 0. So all the space is being taken up. Anything above that, at about a factor of 3, it's reasonable to say that there's a 10% vacancy rate, and 6, that vacancy rates are sitting at 20%. And you can see there, in all the sort of categories, vacancy rates are above 10%. And typically, in terms of property economics, you want vacancy rates to be at around 6%, 6.5% if you want to spur on new investment. But as mentioned before, part of this has been this exorbitant investment in office space in the past. And we already were sitting with vacancy rates in excess of 10% at the part of 2018 into 2019. And when the pandemic hit and people were forced out of their offices where they were able to work from home or work remotely, that just added to the stress that landlords were experiencing. And it is a case of that this sort of excess space or available space first needs to be mopped up and first needs to be absorbed before we start to see some of the levers new investment and new expenditure to really come to the fore, or really to take place. Rohde and Associates in their forecasts suggest that these sort of indicators may rise to 20% in sub-regions, in some nodes or regions, and for some segments. And that is a sort of massive space overhang, because you've got this investment, you've got this building, and 80% of the space that you have available is sitting unused. That does sort of change the game a little bit for the office sector. That said, it does open up avenues for new opportunities for those who are willing to explore these new opportunities, and that we'll touch on a little bit in the sort of next set of slides. So the current context of the building sector in particular is categorized by an exacerbation of the sort of weak trends that we saw pre-pandemic. So there wasn't this fact, and there wasn't these mitigating factors to help the sort of sector resistance against what transpired, and also the sort of social and behavioral changes. And I think when we talk about the past, or when we talk about the future in the next few slides, that's quite critical. And one of these things is, and I've titled the slide, "There's no place like home." People increasingly are not just working from home, but we've learned how to live and how to thrive at home. We can do our shopping from the comfort of our couches. We've got entertainment at our fingertips, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and if you can connect to some of the other international streaming sites, you're able to do that. Gambling, online gambling has taken off quite significantly over the past year or so, not taking away some of the social implications thereof, but people are able to entertain themselves at home. Medical care via virtual doctors, exercise via Zoom, personal training sessions, education with schools, particularly private sector education, where all schools in the private sector have opened today, virtually, online, and there's no real consequence of the sort of in-person changes in school in terms of access to curriculum and access to learning, and then obviously finally the ability to work from home. And this sort of package of things has changed the type of homes people are looking for. They're looking for homes in which they can live and which they can thrive. And we've really come from a place in terms of the development or the sort of social aspects where up until recently, let's say up until the beginning of 2020, it seems as though there was a greater move towards security estates, flats and townhouses, looking at sort of communal living, looking at shared space. But now it seems to have been reversed. Now it seems as though we're looking for spaces where we can do it all. We're looking for bigger spaces. We're looking for versatile spaces, because now we want to enjoy ourselves, and we want to exercise, and we want to have space to work, and we want to or space to learn, and we want a place to work. So that has changed some of the elements somewhat, and we've actually already started picking it up in the data. We cannot pinpoint it exactly, but there are clear trends that are emerging that we from the data we have for the first half of this year, which seem to be gathering momentum, and we seem to getting more traction. And I will allude to some of that data somewhat later on. The other sort of perspective, and this adds to the uncertainty component and the uncertainty element, is what are we going to do with all office space? What are we going to do with close to 20% vacancy rates in some sort of grades of offices? And there's already some talk of converting office space into residential space. I mentioned earlier in my introduction that we have been overinvested in office and banking space. We've overinvested in shopping space. But where we haven't invested sufficiently is in housing, or at least not in the type or level or affordability of housing that we need given our particular social context. So there are opportunities opening up with a sort of work from home trends, should they persist, and the benefits to reutilizing that office space which becomes available. But while there have been many benefits to working from home, and on a personal note, one of the benefits was I can now see all the flaws in my home, and I've bought paint, and I've bought locks, and I've bought so many things with which to tackle some DIY projects. Now it's staring at me in my office that the hinge is loose or something has changed. So there has been more spillovers just on the property side of things. And you know, the benefits and the jury on deciding whether or not or what system is going to work going forward, it's still out. There does seem a mismatch between what employers expect and employees expect. Now, McKinsey did a study about 2 or 3 months ago, and they've interviewed about 5,000 individuals across the world. So it's part of their global suite of global surveys, and they just try to compare pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, what's the expectations of employers and what the expectation is of employees. And a very interesting, the mismatch between what is expected in a sort of post-pandemic world. Let's say we are able to move back to offices tomorrow. What is the expectation? And from employers, it's clear. More than half of them expect their employees to be back at the office for 4 days or more in a sort of pre-pandemic world. So the idea of persistent vacancy rates is perhaps not as stark or as worrying. The concern from an office space perspective is that employees are not really keen to be back at the work for as many days or as regularly as what they were before the pandemic. And you can see that 50% of them prefer a hybrid model. In other words, they just prefer the choice. They just want the option to be able to work from the office or to be able to work from home as they choose. So it's going to be interesting to see how this sort of phenomenon plays out. Outside of the construction sector, we've really seen talks of the great resignation, where to go back to the office for some may become a deal breaker. And we have 52% of firms who want people back at the office, and 52%, or in fact only 40%, that actually feel we want to come back on site. And so from a social perspective, there's that element. It's outside of the scope of this discussion, but I do think that the world is going to take some time to get to an equilibrium position, and in that time we're still going to have the sort of high vacancy rates domestically that we currently see on the office front. And again, the opportunity there is to shift some things around. So by way of some of the data that we've seen, and this is interesting from the residential perspective. So what I've done is I've just compared the value or the amount of square meters of building plans passed for the residential sector and the non-residential sector into the various subcomponents, and I've compared the total for January to May of this year to the same period in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And obviously across the board, we see this sharp drop off in 2019 versus 2020 and an uptick in 2020 versus 2021. But I've also compared it to the average square meters of plans between 2010 and 2017 to sort of give a longer term perspective. And we are seeing this move towards what we would refer to as single dwelling homes, unattached homes of greater or equal to 80 meters. And if you look at the sort of graph on the left hand side, you'll see that the current amount of meters of plans passed for these homes far exceeds the level of 2019. 18 and exceeds the average that we saw in between 2010 and 2017. In contrast, and this is what we're seeing with the flat vacancy rates, and this is sort of to those flat vacancy rates. Residential plans passed for flats and townhouses by square meter is much lower now than what they were in 2019 and 2018. And you can argue, yes, there was a lot of investment, a lot of building in that space, but looking ahead, it seems as though there's a preference now for single dwelling homes and larger homes, which was not the case over the last decade or so, with regards to what exists in the pipeline. From the non-residential sector side, and I think this highlights the woes in the retail space and the woes in the office and banking space. I've done the same, I've done the very same exercise, and you can see there square meterage for office space is well below the average for 2019, 18, and the sort of longer term version or medium term version. And similarly for shopping space, there aren't as many new projects coming on board for these types of non-residential buildings, because we've built so many of them and we have so many of them that are standing vacant. There's just very little legs for that sort of sub-market to stand on. In contrast, we're seeing quite a bit of activity for industrial and warehousing space. And if you look at that level for 2021, again, it far exceeds that January of May 2020, 2019, 2018, and the sort of medium-term average levels. There is some link to the rise in online shopping. So sort of distribution centers. If you look at the biggest online shopping entity in South Africa, Takealot, a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, they had main distribution hubs in KZN, in Gauteng, and in Cape Town, in Montague Gardens. Now they've got 4 or 5 distribution centers in Cape Town. They've got distribution centers in the Northern Cape, in the Free State. So and they've got quite a big customer base. I've got a family member, a close family member of mine that lives just in a very rural part of the Northern Cape, and he says all he does all day is order things on Takealot. And I wouldn't imagine such a far-flung place being as accessible, but it's because of these sort of decentralized distribution centers that are popping up and cropping up all over the country. And it's not just for Takealot, but it's for quite a number of other established companies and new companies looking to enter the sort of online market and online shopping market. And I think that's really spurred on some of this investment, along with, and this is an aside to the pure construction sector, along with somewhat of a revival in the manufacturing sector at the moment, which we've seen really accelerate post the first harsh lockdown in the middle of last year. And so in all the sort of pessimism in the construction generally, even before the crisis and the data that we're seeing in the midst of the crisis, there are some pockets, but it does mean that space is changing. How we use space is changing, and the type of space that we are looking to is changing. How persistent this will be, how it's going to look in 12 months' time, like all other things in economics is still quite uncertain, but there are definitely changes to how the South African building construction is doing things now compared to a year ago. I started the discussion also mentioning the civil construction sector, and I just want to share one slide on this, and this is the infrastructure spending plans from the government in their budget speech of 2020. And you can see that there's a large chunk of expenditure that's being tabulated for the rest of the sort of what they refer to as the medium-term expenditure framework. That's all 3-year periods outside of when they actually do the announcements. So for this set of, or for this medium-term expenditure framework, we are sitting with a budget of about 700 or close to 800 billion rand for infrastructure. Now, much of what you see by way of infrastructure is footed by the fiscus, is footed by government accounts. So it's very important how this sort of evolves. The problem is that our fiscus is quite constrained, and Andre mentioned it in his discussion earlier. It's not just constrained by way of current expenditure, but at some point in time, you also have to look at capex, and capex is what you need to ensure that there is room for an economy to grow. And it's a very sort of, it's the type of spending that you don't easily want in. But because of how our fiscal situation is, it's one that's been unavoidable. And I want to compare the medium-term expenditure framework for the most latest budget with what we've seen in previous budgets, particularly because this is what we refer to as current prices. So it's not adjusted for inflation. These numbers, the almost 100 billion, pales in comparison to what we saw in medium-term budgets in the past, particularly if you go back to as recent as 2017, 2018, when we almost had 950 billion rand penciled in for infrastructure over the medium term. So we're sitting with almost 150 billion rand less planned, and this is in sort of current prices. So in real terms, if you had to adjust for inflation, the capex allocation by the state, and this is for public sector enterprises as well, so it includes Eskom, Prasa, Transnet, is more than 200 billion rand lower in real terms 5 years later. So the space to accelerate infrastructure from a national government perspective is very limited, and that is why the sort of very early movements on structural reform are so important. Andre mentioned about the 100 megawatt cap for licensing. That's a very positive move in terms of, and this is the sort of kicker, in terms of partnering with the private sector to ensure that the appropriate infrastructure is set up. And when you're talking about the availability of space, you also have to talk about, and the utilization of space, you also have to talk about access to that space. And you get access to new residential units, and you get access to new airports, you get access to new offices or shopping centers or industrial space via roads. And you sustain that through water infrastructure and electricity infrastructure. So it's these sort of latent movements in the policy space or the policy reform space, which has hints of a more pro-private sector approach, is definitely welcome, and will hopefully be able to sort of support the state to spend, or for infrastructure spend or civil construction spend, to sort of exceed the sort of 850 billion or the 800 billion, apologies, that's penciled in over the next couple of years. Theo has asked me to also just share one or two facets of the recent social unrest, and this is a very interesting infographic from SAPOA, which just looks at the sort of damage sustained by retailers, damage sustained, and the type of buildings where the damage was most pronounced. So we had a lot of damage at shopping centers, at malls, some at warehouses, at factories, which is about our economic capacity, and liquor outlets. And I suppose the fact that they're not access liquor in other forms probably contributed to that, but the impact was quite pronounced. According to SAPOA's calculations, it's about 20 billion on the economy of KZN alone, and about 50 billion in terms of the spillover effects on the national economy. But outside of that, and tied to the discussion of the previous slide, is what does this do for our image in the eyes of the investor, particularly the international investor? I think we are saved in the sense that there is unrest in other countries. I don't think that's too much of a silver lining, but there's unrest in other countries which maybe gets more media coverage outside, but it's definitely something that plays on the mind of the investor. So we have a need for infrastructure, we have a need for certain types of investment, and we don't have the financial capacity domestically to really carry all that, and we need sort of international interest and international investment. But if they were to have seen the scenes as intimately as we saw them locally, I think that would have really done much more damage to our, or more damage to our international reputation than what we need.
Craig, we in the last 10 minutes of your allocated time.
Thank you, Theo. I have asked Theo to be very strict with me because, like most economists, I'm very long-winded. But you would be glad to know, Theo, that this is my last slide, and I think we can move on to questions. I can't promise answers, but we can discuss some of the elements that I've shared in my slides now. But I do think, yes, we can move on to the Q&A, Theo. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Craig. We are going to ask Ms. Valencia Simmons to thank you towards the end of this session. But I've got a question. I've seen during COVID-19 a huge growth in do-it-yourself building shops and outlets in the USA as well as Europe. Do we see the same trend in South Africa, thinking about the one slide you've shown about your house and everything that goes around that? Do we see the same statistics?
Yes, Theo. Actually, our residential sector seems to mimic that which we see internationally on a regular basis, and we've definitely seen that in the numbers. In fact, to our surprise, the sort of sales of retail hardware outperformed every other category as soon as the sort of harsh lockdown ended. So from July of last year onward, we saw that being the sort of biggest growth engine for retail sales, and it is linked to the work from home, because we saw a similar improvement in the furniture and appliance subsector. So you need a new office chair, or you need an office chair, you need a desk, you need a lick of paint, you need to subdivide your home, so there's many facets to this which have been supportive. And of course, you are limited by way of doing anything else. So you weren't able to travel internationally, and you weren't able to do many other things with money. And the one where you could and would have shown probably the greatest sort of satisfaction is on home improvements. So definitely saw that trend through the latter part of last year, and even now it is still one of the better performing subclasses of the sector.
I also have a question from Johan Jordan. He's asking whether we are heading for a situation where office space may be converted into domestic accommodation due to maybe less people using it following COVID and these kind of things. Do you see any sign thereof?
There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that's pointing towards that sort of refurbishment, especially because of the amount of office stock that is available. You can either decide to keep it vacant and try and especially, so we're seeing these vacancies, especially in the sort of older buildings. So if you want to compete in the office space or continue to compete in the office space, it's really difficult to do so against buildings that opened up last year or the year before. So especially among the older stock, there is this discussion with regard to refurbishing it and making it into rental units. The key question from a social perspective is not so much the demand, but about the affordability. So hopefully, at least from my perspective, that when we do get these units online or this office space does get converted to residential space, that it would be of the sort of mid level of affordability. Otherwise, we're just going to sit with more residential space. So we already have flats and townhouses where vacancies are are quite high. To just convert and to try and match that by way of price, it's just going to cause those vacancy rates to rise quite significantly. So there's going to be a lot of movement by way of price over the next couple of months, in my opinion.
Well, I must share with you my personal situation, that COVID-19 came to all of us as a shock last year, but most of us over the age of 60, and I retired at the end of last year, received letters from the university towards March of 2020, not allowing us on campus anymore. Now, tongue in cheek, I was actually waiting for that letter about 10 years ago, but it never came. But so last year, we, the old bullies, had to stay off campus. Now, what it did to me, it actually prepared me and it helped me towards going on pension, because very often when that pensionable age starts, suddenly you feel nobody cares about you anymore. You're not at work anymore. So for me, it was actually a great positive in that it assisted me in getting used to a different lifestyle once you formally going on pension. So there's a lot of things happening, and I was interested in that slide that you showed from, I think it was McKinsey, the difference between the employer and the employee, who wants to work at home and who wants to go back to the office. And it seems to me, what I see is that most female workers, like my own daughter at the age of 40, with 2 kids at home, she wants to go back to office. Being at home, working with the kids, just is becoming a very difficult one. They're very social kind of issues.
Yeah, I think it goes 2 ways. The one is sort of impression you've shared with us, and the other is that it has forced people to re-look their priorities, because they were stuck at home. Some people took up gardening, some people started a new hobby, maybe what we would call a side hustle, and some spent more time with family. And you know, part of this great, or this expectation of the great resignation, is that people don't want to go back to the 9-to-5s that they experienced before the pandemic. They want to have the option of gardening during the middle of the day, or going for a round of golf, and work at 9. And I suppose us in academia, Theo, have had that luxury for a while, but others seem to have caught on to that. And you know, that's why I say that the jury is really out on what the net effect of all this would be. It's not cut and dry, and it's not a sort of homogeneous impression of working from home, both from the employee and the employer's perspective.
Well, I would like to thank you, Craig. It was really a very, very well prepared presentation, but I'm going to ask Dr. Valencia Simmons to do the honors of thanking you for your presentation. Valencia?
On behalf of the AA Phase 1 and Phase 2, Mr. Craig Lemboe, we want to extend our vote of thanks for navigating so well through this uncertain economic circumstances which we find ourselves, and bring it into context, and also prickling our minds in that regard. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Theo, I will share these slides with you, and you're welcome to follow the BER on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And we provide regular updates on the macroeconomy and on the building and construction sector.
Thank you very much. I am a follower of BER, and I have showed you that slides previously that I do with the permission of Professor Kirsten, an old friend of mine. But thank you very much again for your participation.